So the issue that we're now dealing with judicial reforms, the question is, why are we dealing with that issue now? How did that become, right? If you would have asked me a year ago or 2 years ago, what issue could bring us to a potential civil war, I would say...
Do you think it's that bad? Do you think there's a civil war on the horizon?
I said potential.
Well, but that means that that realistic possibility.
It's a realistic possibility. It depends on how you define a civil war.
I mean, if you're putting it on the table... Well, I define a civil war by American education standards.
Education. We're not going to have, we're not going to have army units against army units, etc. But when you start having violence, you could start calling it some version of a civil war. But if I thought there would be any potential of civil war, would be if we had decided we had a peace plan with the Palestinians and we're pulling out of the West Bank, Yehuda v'Shamron. That could bring us to the verge of a civil war, in my opinion. I said this to a friend of mine the other day, who was formerly a high-ranking army officer, and he said, no, what this is the opposite. This is taking place in advance of that. What am I saying by that? Those people who want to make judicial reforms, part of the reason they want to make judicial reforms is to make sure we never give up the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, and they want to pass laws that will annex Judea and Samaria, and they're afraid that the Supreme Court might stop that. That's part of the issue. I mean, the other part of the issue is the question of religion and state.
Right.
And we haven't defined that. I mean, I blame Ben-Gurion for that. Ben-Gurion, on two levels. Number one, he didn't want to have a constitution.
He didn't want one, or he didn't think he could do it at the moment.
He didn't want to deal with it. He wanted one. He didn't want to deal with it. In the middle of the end of the War of Independence, he didn't want to deal with it. Also, and this I only learned recently while doing some research for a book I'm trying to write, he, in 1949, before the first elections, he wanted to have regional elections. In other words, that Knesset members would be from different areas.
Wouldn't that be nice?
And the reason we didn't have it was some of the people in Mapai, his party, were against it. But ultimately he decided against it because at that point such a high percentage of Israelis were in the army that they felt they wouldn't be able to figure out who belonged where and have regional elections. So as a temporary solution, we had national lists. And so this temporary solution is something that is destroyed.
So why not write it into that law, though, that this is a temporary national list?
Because they weren't thinking. Look, so much of our laws are just temporary. We inherited the parliament of the World Zionist Organization, for God's sakes. Half of our laws are English, a quarter of them are Ottoman. There are very few laws that were written here. We've inherited so many things without thinking. And here the Jewish people, with just thoughtfulness, and we have all these people studying Talmud, which effectively is law all the time, and yet we don't have our own system, and we didn't have our own. I feel like that's not like a lapse in judgment either, which I don't think that's what you're saying, but it doesn't sound to me like it was a lapse in judgment, but rather an outcome of being pressed for time constantly. Okay, yes and no. So let's look at back. The only major change that we've made in this country in the last 20 years in terms of electoral reform was the direct election of the prime ministers that lasted twice. Mm-hmm. And what happened during direct election of the prime ministers? The number of votes that the big parties got went down drastically. And so they decided, no, this is decreasing our power, so we're going to get rid of it. We're going to go back to the system we had previously. The number of votes the big parties got continued to drop. It didn't make any difference. It was being caused by something else altogether.
Did we figure out what that was?
Well, it's the identification and splitting identities, and also the big parties themselves started to self-implode to some extent. But listen, that was a positive thing when we had direct elections of a prime minister. What we needed to do, what we desperately need, is regional elections of Knesset members. We need to have a Knesset member from this neighborhood, whatever we call this neighborhood. But at that point, Knesset members will not have to vote with their party. They'll have to vote with their constituents. Right now, no Knesset member is independent. No one gets elected independently. Sometimes in two parties within the party, but even that's a small list of people.
Right.
So they can't, and they don't get selected in where they sit on the list based on anything but what the party leaders do. So they can't go against their party leaders. So our Knesset members are not independent in any which way. Not to mention they don't give any services to constituents like in America, where congressmen give constituent services. If you and I have a problem, there's no way to solve it except if we have protexia. If we have protexia, we know somebody, then someone
We're
can
talking
help
about mob style protection.
Right, but not mob style. Just the fact that you know the right person. Know somebody. I mean, I know because of my years working as a journalist, I know people in various parties, and I can call somebody and I can get some help possibly. But if I don't, if I'm a person from the street, I can't get that. In America, you can call your congressman, your senator, and they actually have whole departments designed to help their citizens in their problems with the government. We don't have that at all in this country. And that's because we don't have regional elections, because we have a national list. That would be a simple thing that would increase our democracy substantially. I mean, that's one of the ABCs that would do it, but that would mean, changes. I once had the idea we were going to run an election campaign just for change. And everyone who was part of that party said they would sign that they would resign and end the Knesset as soon as they passed the laws to change the system of government. But it would never work because everyone's worried about so many other things that we'd never get enough votes to make it worthwhile.
You'd never feel like your work was done.
Right. Well, listen, there was a party I was involved with when I first moved to Israel called Dash, which was to change the system of government in 1977. It was led by Yigal Yadin. And ultimately they just didn't get enough votes. They had 15 places, and Yadin decided to go into the Begin government, and that was the end of it. So that was the great hope. Back then we knew we needed change. And that was 1977.